All right. So I'm Dr. Megan Kirby. I am the Dissemination and Implementation Specialist with Language Dynamics Group. Welcome to this free webinar on using Story Champs lesson plans, so what we call the MLPs. And I will walk you through just kind of the basics. This is not intending to replace like the training that we provide. We do provide just basic training is about 6 hours and all day or split off across multiple days. So if you're interested in that, let me know. Okay, so today we are going to learn how to select Story Champs master lesson plans or just MLPs, and then just in general, and then how to implement those lesson plans with fidelity as well. So the scope of the lessons, they just basically begin with mastery of basic discourse structure. We want students to be able to efficiently build complex language. This is the key, right? So what makes Story Champs effective are these key ingredients like multiple exemplar training, the fact that we use many, many different stories, but they all have the same structure, right? We can use the same lesson plan, but it's the stories that change out every time we do a session until we change our lesson plan. Could be next week. It could be like 6 sessions. It could be in 6 months. It's about the progress of the learner. Sometimes they're slow and steady if we're doing intervention and it's an older student and they didn't get any of this instruction early on. But some of our younger learners will rock it, right? And so they really advance really quickly. But also, a lot of the information for Story Champs that gets us, the large effects in the research are the fact that we also have active student or learner responding, so it keeps them engaged, multiple opportunities for learner responding, so not just sitting there and only being able to answer or contribute like one time for the 30-minute period because you have 30 students, right? So that's a no-no. Prompting, fading techniques, all of those are built in. The fact that the users don't have to spend time differentiating instruction beyond just like for unique students, but having to adapt one lesson plan. So I remember as a special education teacher, and I had students in grades primary through grade 6 or K through 6. Oh, what a nightmare. Um, and so they would be with me half the day, and then I would, I don't know, somehow clone myself. I don't know how I did it, but somehow clone myself and go with these students to their different grade levels for when they had time spent in science usually and history. But if I was lucky, the teachers would give me the lesson plan in advance and their unit information, and I would have time to adapt to the lesson plan for my learner. Most of the time, it just kind of like was an aid in their classroom because they didn't give me that information in advance. So it's really like this is what Story Champs does. It saves us time because we've got arrangements for whole group, small group, or large group, small group, and one-to-one pre-made. So that just kind of print it out, take it and go. We've got explicit instruction right in these primary targets, and I'll go over that. But then we've also got this ways for you to flex either the prompts or the order in which you're going to present things. We provide immediate feedback. This is key. We'll go over that. We have what's called a two-step correction procedure. And then my favorite piece about this, and I I don't know, I think I'm biased, but most learners love the fact that they never get anything wrong in Story Champs. If you are using it as an intervention, like the reason why we got into this is to like help learners learn, not just to take data and just do assessments all the time. Um, then you'll use what the free measures that we offer for the cubed, right? The narrative language measures, either listening or reading. You'll use those for progress monitoring and not poison the well by like taking data during story champ sessions. It should be teaching time that should be protected, put a bubble around it. It's you and the learner or learners, and you get to prompt and prompt fade and not allow them to make errors so they're not discouraged. Okay, so how do you select a story champs lesson plan? Like there's a lot of things that are all built into it, but how do you just like go pick one out, right? Well, what I would hope that you would do is that when you get your Story Champs kit, right on top is this quick start guide. And I'm showing you on this screen, it is the third grade. um, quick start guide. In Utopia world, and maybe if anybody here in tonight who's attending or this morning who is attending this, if you're using this in the general education curriculum and you're a third grade teacher or someone who collaborates with a third grade teacher and you're using this as such, please let me know. But most of the time, it's being used as an intervention. But this is what it was intended for. This is to be delivered in a multi-tiered system of language supports. So hypothetically, this would be our third grade. By the end of third grade, these are things that students should be able to do. Okay. So if I'm a third grade teacher, I would pick this out and say, okay, so in my English language arts curricula, I need to teach story structure. I'm going to use this whole school year, large group lesson plans 12, 13, and 14. And what are my focuses of those lessons? Advanced story structure, fictional stories. I'm going to use blitz stories that are at level J. Oh, for my information or like science and history or other nonfiction content areas where I need to teach structure of expository language, here I go. Here are my goals. These are all aligned with the Common Core state standards um, in the United States or CKLA, whatever. I think between those two, it's really easy. Most state standards in the United States follow some, they stole from the Common Core basically. They didn't want to like use it because states' rights and no one liked Obama. Um, like no one wanted him telling them what to do, and yet most state standards actually mirror these right here. So that's where we got them from, and they're most alike across all of the U.S. Departments of Education. So complex language, vocabulary, writing. Now this is called the scope. So what's the scope of Story Champs and what lessons target? The sequence, any good curriculum has a scope and sequence, right? The sequence is going to be found at the bottom of this page, and that's where you see average, high arrangements, large and small groups. So this, think again, general education curriculum. This is not intervention. If I'm a classroom teacher and I'm running these things either in literacy centers or in a large group, this is my scope for or my sequence of this scope for the entire school year. How awesome. Now, cycles could be considered or thought of as beginning of the year, middle of the year, end of year, right? And then if I'm using Story Champs as an intervention and I might have students who are in, let's say, 8th grade or adolescents, um, I might come here and work my way backwards to see where they need or what they need and where they're at. If I didn't use the narrative language measures listening or reading assessments to benchmark and try to get a baseline, I can at least open Story Champs, right? And there's many reasons why you wouldn't be able to do that. You didn't have time. Time is gold. So let's just go there. Then you got Story Champs and you want to use it. Heard great things about it. Open this up, take a peek, read it, kind of be like, oh yeah, I think my students are here. And then look at the bottom and it kind of lays out what lesson plans that you will need, what story level, and then kind of maybe a pacing guide. And this is just suggested. I want you to see the word suggested right there. This is not written in stone. But after 6 sessions, could do one a week for 6 weeks. Okay, then I would recommend maybe like either just go ahead and move on or go ahead and assess to see if you should move on. And the assessment again comes from that free cube, the narrative language measures. We have all those progress monitoring tools. Any more questions on the cubed and how to do all of that? Goals and objective writing, those I've done webinars on them and they're recorded and posted to our website. So you just have to go to implementation and then webinars and you can see a list of all the cool recordings. I think they're cool because I did most of them, but a list of a lot of tools for you. So here's a scope sample. Here are all the lessons that we have across these grade levels. So by the end of this particular grade, this is where students should be at. Okay, so, but if you're going to use this as an intervention, these make like really great like prompts for goal rating. Just ignore the grade level. But these are all of the lesson plans that we offer that target vocabulary, right? So add-on lesson plans 59, 61, you see a lot of those 65, 60, 58, 50. And then what are those lesson plans? They tell you right here over to the right. Informational structure. So how do you this is the gold that few people know, that we have lesson plans for these things, to teach expository language structure, right? And so if you look here, by the end of that particular grade level, kindergarten being primary for those who are not in the United States, then you can see like the large group, small group, and individual lesson plans that you could pull to teach those things at whatever level that they're at. My favorite are the writing, because that's where some of my research has been in, and I think it's just, I love it. You can't write what you cannot say. Love that quote. Um, Here you go. Here's what the expectations are developmentally. So if you need a developmental sequence, where do you go next? What should be expected of your learner in developmental sequence? This kind of lays it out. So use that quick start guide and look at the whole like scope of everything that we can teach. All right. If you have any questions, kind of throw them in the Q&A and I'll get to them too. All right. So general sequence. How do we lay out our lesson plans? And so if you're looking at the PDF and all of them, don't print them all out. You just want to print out whatever it is that you need at that time. Don't be a master of everything. What I would recommend is that you first work on discourse structure, right? Story structure. If you cannot retell someone else's story, which is easier than telling your own, but if you cannot retell someone else's story using a basic episode, so 5 components of a story, you've got character, you've got a problem, you've got a feeling that the character experiences in response to that problem, then you've got some kind of action, attempt that they attempt to solve the problem, and then you have them solving the problem. So like that's a basic story episode, just 5 elements. Um, we need our learners to be there first, and we need them to be able to retell someone else's story because it's been provided to them. They have to listen, and provide in that retell those 5 elements. That's going to be just basic story structure. I want them to work on a master fictional retell and then very quickly go to personal generation. Ultimately, the whole idea is not to like maintain, let's retell someone else's story. We want to encourage and empower our learners with the ability to tell their own, to advocate for their needs, to tell someone what happened to them so they can get help, right? And tell good stories too, but those tend to be shorter. So instructionally, our stories are include problems because otherwise we wouldn't have enough content. The story would be very short and it's over. But with problems, we can elaborate and then include that complex language and more elements. So once you've got this basic story structure, they can retell and now they can generate their own. I'm adding in complex language modifiers. I want to move to enhanced story structure. So that's just adding 2 more elements, adding setting and end feeling. I want them to retell stories, but then quickly generate their own, just having that basic structure. And then, boom, let's start adding in more complex language. When you retell or tell a story, please include causal subordinate clauses. So please use words like because, so that, since. Okay. Then I want to work on temporal. So this is developmental. Causal, then temporal, right? And that's using words like when, after, before, while, as, until. And then after I've got a good handle of these linking terms. So if I've got these pieces of a story, now I've got terms that link these events. Now I'm gonna add in or fold in, sorry, just think about Schitt's Creek. But like I'm gonna fold in modifiers, right? Sorry, now I'm distracted by like what folded in means. So I'm going to fold in some modifiers, and that's going to be the emphasis on these adjectives and adverbs to make these stories, one, more entertaining, but really paint a picture for the audience so that they are engaged. Storytelling is relationship building, right? At any time, let's say you're getting bored, at any time, you can add in and do these add-on lesson plans, um, such as like teaching explicit vocabulary for the high frequency, the words that come in, with the level A, level B classic stories, or blitz, how to teach vocabulary inferencing or word meaning. So I really I encourage it. Also, you can use those information structure lesson plans anytime. So let's say you know a teacher. Let's say you're an SLP or reading literacy specialist coach, and you know a teacher's struggling with how to teach students how to retell the information that she just read from this science textbook. Um, I've heard so many great things. I think Paducah in Kentucky. There's some really there's a pair of folks that are doing great work together, an SLP and a special ed teacher, and they're rocking it with those lessons with their middle schoolers. So kudos to them. Okay, so we're gonna get to like more visuals. Don't worry. So we're gonna break down the lesson plans. I'm gonna go over it, and we're gonna get there. But in summary, this is what I want you to know. You're going to prioritize, we're going to pick lessons when we get started that focus on narrative or discourse structure, okay? And then I will pick goals or work on lessons that deal with complex language, okay? So we want our students or our learners to retell stories that have a complete episode. Like, please just let me understand what you're saying. You need a complete episode for that, right? So they need a complete episode and then they can use linking words. Because we can't be teaching causal and temporal subordinates if there's nothing to connect, right? Like if they don't have a problem and then a plan and an attempt, like one of those things is missing, we can't use the word because. Or we don't have a feeling and then the problem, like one of those is missing, we can't say, oh, he was crying or he felt sad because he hurt his knee, right? So we need the pieces, the elements, those events in the story well established before we start teaching the more complex academic language, those causal, temporal, connecting words, and modifiers. Hopefully that makes sense. All right. So where do you find your lesson plans? Da, 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 da. You're going to find them on the PDF, and as a PDF rather, on the flash drive or USB. Okay, so they're located on that USB or flash drive. If yours somehow stops working, my email's at the end. You will email me and tell me like your name or whoever ordered it, approximately when your kit was ordered, so I can um, figure out the replacement for you. Sometimes they just stop working. Okay. And then you've got writing activities, but really it's the lesson plans that, that you need here. Okay, so they're on that USB or flash drive. And when you open it up, there's just one PDF file. And then this is what the table of contents looks like for the large group. And so large group lesson plans are always in purple. And they're going to rely or include these key things as a teaching procedures, right? Systematic scaffolding, no brainer. Signaling, so like 1, 2, 3, and then having the class respond together, so choral responding, right? Story gestures, so I'll go over that. And then questioning, so asking WH questions and as a prompt during a story retell. Then having students take individual turns, but we use peer tutoring for that, evidence-based practice, and then least restrictive prompts and correction procedures. So we'll go through that too. Here on the right, though, I want you to notice that the developmental sequence minus writing, like and information, but the developmental sequence right here between we start with the basic story structure, then enhanced, then causal, then temporal modifiers. This right here is like a developmental sequence of narrative language in a nutshell. Small group. Oh, let me go back. Large group. This is going to be like a game changer for some of you. If you have a small group of 5 or more students, you actually have a large group. So use the large group lesson plans, even if you're doing intervention. This isn't just like for gen ed. It isn't for classes or groups like 20 students. This is for 5 or more students. So if you are actually doing intervention and you have a group of 5 or 6 students, please just don't modify and adapt the small group ones. Go ahead and just pull a large group one. Hopefully that helps some of you. Then for small group, this is for 4 students or fewer, obviously not 1-to-1, but 2 to 4 students. And the difference between the large group and small group is that you have different seating rotation, the way turns are taken. Quickly we move into personal story generation, like even sometimes within the same lesson plan, we start working on that. Story games instead of just story gestures and champs checks. We don't necessarily only rely on those. So we'll get to that. Scaffolding, corrections, prompting, differentiation, allowing different variations. These are basically just good teaching practices, right? These are just things that make it more effective. And then individual. So if you're doing one-on-one intervention with a student, either because this student just kind of sticks out and isn't a good fit for a group, um, they're either below or advanced as to where the rest of the group are, or they're so far behind that they really need intensive intervention that just supplemental tier 2 instruction or small group is not going to be enough, right? One-on-one lesson plans. So you could be working on the same targets, but it's just the teaching arrangement that is different. So in this particular case, right, so we've got all of the good teaching practices here. Seating rotation, personal stories we move right into. You can play story games if you want, but the seating rotation, what I mean by this is also in some of the videos and the demonstration videos on the website. We won't watch videos tonight, unfortunately, but on the demonstration videos on the website for individual lessons, right? So there's this, Trina's doing a lesson, and I believe it's lesson plan 44. And then Stuart is the student or the learner. And the way Trina sits next to him instead of behind him or across from him, so sit next to him. And then also when it's time to tell the personal story, for him to generate it and she's coaching him, it's really important that you like get right there so that we're teaching conversational skills that if I'm talking, I expect you to be a listener and us to our shoulders to be facing each other. There's just a whole bunch of like social skills that you could be working on in terms of nonverbal speaker behavior and listening behavior. Okay, thanks for bearing with me on that one. So that's just like how I would select it. Does anybody have any questions on how to select a lesson plan before we move on? Because I do not mind. I'm going to check the Q&A just right quick. So I have someone who asked, which is just a great question. I have students that have been working on a certain lesson for multiple weeks. For in this particular example, it's enhanced story structure. So let me like turn back here. Hold on. Let's just have this up. Here we go. So let's say they're working on enhanced story structure. So this is master lesson plan 26. And this individual feels like they've mastered the skill of this lesson. How do I know what to move on to next? There's so many add-on lesson plans suggested in the master lesson guide doesn't necessarily move in sequential order. Okay, so enhanced story structure is right here. That's where you retell a story, right? Using all key 7 parts. But if I can go back, this will let me. Let's go. This is a great question. Oh, maybe not. I don't have the guide. Let's say, sorry about this, y'all. All right, so let's say that I'm actually like, what I would do here is I want to work on like story structure. I would take out my quick start guide that's at the top of my kit, and I would find and again, skip the grade level. I'm gonna go fast. Skip the grade level, but I would go, in fact, I can get it right now. And walk you through this. Okay. So if I find out where they're at in terms of enhanced story structure, and that would be, let's say, as a small group, it's master lesson plan 26. All I have to do, and I hate when this happens, but sorry. Ooh, let's stop this video. Okay. So all I would have to do is there we go. Find whatever grade level that has, ignore the grade level at the top, but find where it says small group, number 20, MLP 26. And if I'm looking through this right quick, I'm at kindergarten. And that's retell a story with key details. And the guidance says kindergartners, but ignore that. Should produce stories with 7 main parts: character, setting, problem, feeling, action, ending, and end feeling. We refer to this as a complete episode. Introduce fictional stories once students can produce a complete episode retell and personal story, right? So it's suggesting that we move on to generating fictional stories, right? Personal, but then let's start generating other stories. It asks, or it suggests that at the bottom, just going to have to do this, and you're going to have to ignore my background. Okay. So it suggests here at the bottom that there's this scope. I'm sorry, I can't zoom in. Under cycle 1, you would probably be at the second of the successions. Under cycle 2, it says language complexity level B classic MLP 26 and add 62. So if you add add-on number 62, then that one is let me see here. Add on 60, and yes, you are supposed to be seeing me. Sorry, Kate. You can't see me, everybody. I apologize. On the bottom of the kindergarten quick start guide is what I've been talking about. Somehow, if you can't see me, I apologize. But basically, what I'm talking about is how do you move in terms of a sequence from Master Lesson Plan 26, so this is the enhanced story structure, to then making that jump into complex language. So once you have structure, you need to be working on complex language, but keeping that structure. I don't think you need to be moving on to, let's say, adding in per se, like plan or those metacognitive verbs. We don't need to be moving there yet, or adding like enhanced plus story structure, where also the consequence is different from the ending. Sometimes that can get too complex. I might stick with lesson plan 26 and have the add-ons like suggested, where I'm going to start teaching the causal connections, right? Here, we'll take a look. All right, so when I pull a lesson plan, I'm just going to back up for a second. We're going to get into like how to know, differentiate, how to move on. When I go to the materials, like how do I know what story level to use? This is a huge thing that people have a lot of questions about. You will, honestly, if you just pick a lesson plan, I promise you that you will be a-okay in terms of it will tell you exactly what story level you need. It'll tell you exactly how many of those icons that you're going to need, and it will tell you exactly like what games or champs checks, so on and so forth. So this is the one for large groups. So you can see like, hey, it says level A stories, either classic or blitz, doesn't matter. Let's see here. Then we have illustrations. It tells me which illustration cards, story grammar icons. It has those right there. And then also like for champs checks, dry erase boards. For small group and then for the one-to-one, everything is the same. So no matter what, it will always tell you what you need. So if you forget and you lose that quick start guide, whatever, at least you have a lesson plan, and the lesson plan will tell you exactly what you need. Now, how do you use the materials? So when I've got all the materials that the lesson plan says, so let's say this is before I have a small group intervention session. So I've got like 10 minutes. So I pull my lesson plan and I'm like, oh, okay, I'm going to just pick out this story today. I do recommend that you look at the stories before you start reading them. Sometimes you don't like the stories or you want to change the name of the character. So those things are flexible ingredients. Like you can pick what story you want to tell. You just can't tell the same story in consecutive sessions. So use a tracking guide to make sure you don't repeat stories. Get through enough that you can repeat that one. And honestly, when you're teaching, it's a teaching tool. So you don't have to worry about repeating stories like after 10. We have 26, right? But after 10 stories and you repeat one by accident, that's totally fine. They're not going to remember. And then also, we're not assessing them. So that history, that prior instruction piece isn't a thing. We're not using story champs as an assessment. So I gather necessary materials in step 1. Step 2, I'm going to put the illustrations up. I love the digital presentation link, again, on the flash drive. And because it makes things so much easier. But if I have the illustration cards, especially for a small group, I lay them out in advance. I pick my story out of the storybook. I have it open and folded to that story. And my icons are ready to go. And I say that I have them in hand. You could also have them. I mean, the digital presentation link does it for you. So I say these because only the illustration should be out in order. You should not be having the icons out yet on top of the pictures. You are going to be putting them out as you read the story, as you come across that particular part of the story that goes along with the story grammar icon. I'm hoping that this is the right one here. I personally have marked up, and I don't know if you can see this, probably not. Maybe a little bit. I personally have marked up my stories and underlined them in colored pencil with that correspond to the icon, so that, I mean, honestly, you fake it till you make it. When you do these lessons, the kids don't know if you mess up, right? So I have tons and tons of prompts for myself, and one of those prompts is a visual support as to when I'm reading a story. Like last night, Hannah, so that's underlined in purple. I'm putting the purple icon out on that first picture because it's underlined in purple. I do that for all my stories, and how I know, which one is which is pretty. It's easy to figure out. So again, just everything color coded by the icons. So as I'm reading, I'm putting out the icons because that's what the lesson plan tells me to do. And then I also want to make sure that I have my story game manipulatives when I get to that step, or my champs checks ready. So this is just about materials. I do want to talk about like visual support. So I get some questions sometimes about when running story champs lessons, it says to fade out, but what if my learner isn't ready yet? Listen, we wrote this, Trina and Doug, not me, but Trina and Doug have all this research that goes to show that you need to fade out visual supports and transfer independence, or control to the learner, right? Um, over over prompting, especially with visuals, because this is a language program, so it's not true if you say verbal prompts are hardest to get rid of. No, it's the visual ones because this is a language program. We should be talking, right? And so you really want to fade out what's not natural. And what's not natural is that we don't walk around and when we tell stories, magically there's illustrations available that pop up for people, to support not only my storytelling to make sure I have all the components, but also that they understand what I'm talking about. No, no, no. So we want to fade out visuals. And so the whole concept of those steps are we provide all the supports up front, and then systematically, as we've done this, again, Trina and Doug, we as Language Dynamics Group have systematically built in when to prompt and when to fade out those visual supports. Now, I call over prompting dysteachia because it's not the learner's fault. So we don't want to say prompt dependence. It's just the fact that we've gone wrong as teachers by not, or interventionists by not fading things out soon enough, and that there's this over reliance. And then there's a really good, in case you haven't heard this term, it is a term, but you can check out that link in the chat, or I'll put it in the chat right now, about what dysteachia is. And it's kind of funny. So there you go. All right. So Trina and colleagues, so Doug included, published a paper back in 2015, and it provided detail about the prompting and correction procedures. So I threw that up in the references in case you want to read it. But in the study, basically, the interventionists just used their best clinical judgment. And that's what you will do, because we're just researchers over here. We have no knowledge of your student, your learner, and you, and the context and the setting. It would be erroneous for us to tell you exactly what to do in every situation. So you judge, and then you decide what prompt is appropriate. So an indirect prompt like, well, what happened next? Right? To get the student or the learner to provide that response. Or you might have to do a direct prompt like, when you get to the part of the feeling, you'd say something like John was sad because he got hurt. Now you say that. So the interventionist decides what's necessary to get to the learner to use the target that they are particularly working on. If the learner, let's say they're working on the causal tie, the word because, if they don't use that word because, and there was an opportunity for its use, because we're linking two parts, like he was sad because he got hurt, then you're going to want to stop, right? Stop the learner, interrupt, like quickly. Don't let them keep going. So interrupt them, prompt them to use the target. When you do this, like you just suggest what they should say, and you never say, no, 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 you did that wrong. So we're not doing this whole like discrete trial, like, no, that's not right. Try again. You just want to say, hold up, actually say it like this. Or sometimes you have to act confused, like, wait, who are you talking about? Like if they forgot character. So just kind of be natural. You just basically want to ensure that you're a learner, right? Or learners have more than one opportunity to practice the language targets in the lesson. So that's why I want to interrupt, is because I want to have that extra opportunity if it arises, to use the word because. So every opportunity there was available for using the word because, then I want them to use it. And I don't want them to get through the whole story only having used it once. I'm not going to go back and make them retell the story and then use it more times. It's a waste of my time and theirs. And everybody else is engaged in problem behavior now. So basically, like we offer through repetition of the stories, right? Other kids hear their peers, they hear you, retelling certain parts of the stories. Um, that's the key. So you also want to reinforce when they do it, like, great, use the word because. Now start at the problem and tell me the parts of the story again so you can get a good flow because you want the story to flow. But you just always want to encourage praise. Never tell the learner they did something wrong. And honestly, you really want to try to prevent them from getting something wrong anyway. Right? If you know that this is intervention, oh, we'll get there. But, but basically, again, in summary, you use your knowledge of that learner. You judge what level of prompting is necessary to ensure. If you use a prompt, the student better get it right. Right? Otherwise, that was a waste of an opportunity to use a prompt. So you want to use the appropriate level that's going to make sure that the learner contacts success. Okay. So sometimes it may seem pretty intensive or invasive, whatever. But if it's what the learner needs at that moment, use it. So here's how some of these may look. Right? We want the student to never get discouraged that they didn't get something right. We want them to get it right the first time. So if I'm first starting off with basically with story champs, it's a new lesson. I use the narrative language measures listening in the cubed, and I found out my students like they can't retell a story with all the parts. Like they don't have any parts. Then I'm going to be like really providing a lot of these direct verbal or full model prompts. So, for example, let's say I start off asking the question, like I'm having the student retell the story, like all the parts. So I might start off by asking a WH question and then immediately modeling the response that I want to hear, and only at the level I think they can give it back to me. So sometimes that's just like 1 to 2 words. If you have a student using AAC, then you want to model them like how to go and find that response and then do it for them and have them do it. But I might say like, okay, who is the story about? John. John was riding the bike in his picture. So who was the story about? In that's an example of me giving the answer, right? Because I'm not using story champs to assess. I do not want them. I don't want to hear a wrong answer. I don't want all the other students to hear the wrong answer, and then I've got to do an error correction procedure. No one loves learning through trial and error, and like, nope, it's this. Like, no, once you get something wrong, you're less likely to actually learn that particular skill. So learning acquisition rates are higher when we use errorless teaching or learning. So I gave the answer and then I asked the question and I expect them to say it, right? So sometimes you can be sneaky like that and you could fade it out over time. Um, I like to also then add pauses, like let's say, so they're supposed to start at the beginning of the story. So I might have to shorten my verbal prompts, like, who was the story about? John. John was riding a bike. Who was the story about? And then hopefully the student says, John was riding his bike or John. And great, got it. But then tomorrow or next week, when I do my next lesson, I might say something like, who was the story about? Mississippi to Mississippi. Megan. She was having a birthday party. So I wasn't saying Megan. Megan was having a birthday party. Like I shortened it briefly. I also had a wait timer or pause in case the student was going to interject with the right answer, but not too long that they give the wrong answer, right? And then I ask, who's the story about? And hopefully they say Megan was having a birthday party. And then maybe the following lesson I say, who is the story about? Right. And so that's just like a how you can use some of these prompts, but please use prompts, and really try to not let the student fail. I'm not a fan of taking data during story champs because that means you have to let them fail to get your pluses or minuses. And when that happens, learners are less likely to contact success and yada, yada, yada. So use the NLMs for data taking. All right, here we go. So now we're going to take a look at the large group lesson procedures and how they generally pan out. So right here, you see this large group lesson plan one. As the steps say, here you would display, in fact, maybe like big and make them bigger. Here you would display all the illustrations out, right? You'd have them out, you have your storybook out, you'd have your icons ready. You would read the story word for word, right? And as you do so, you place the icons on or near the pictures. The first few times that story champs is going to be used, you should name the story grammar parts and point to the icons. You don't want to take that stuff out and like create a separate lesson outside of story champs. The students will learn. Like you're using the same lesson plan and the same icons, and the stories have the same structure. So usually, even the most slow and steady learners that just you got to be patient with them, they will get this even after like 5 or 6, like they've got it. So don't have to create a whole lesson and like quiz kids on like what these icons mean outside of story champs. So name the story grammar parts, point to them, then have everybody else, if you're doing this large group, right, you're going to have everybody else name those parts. So like as I'm reading the story, I'm like, John was riding his bike down the street. You see this? This is character. Everybody say character, character. That's how you would do it. Step two, it's about story gestures. So in this step, you retell the story again. I usually have the storybook as a guide until I know the stories very well. But in this part in the story retelling, let's say I have the storybook in my lap and I model the gestures. I make sure that all the students are copying the gestures or the behaviors as they go through the parts of the story. So rereading the story, and then this is character. You can also look up on YouTube. You can make up your own, just be consistent. But in general, this is what we use, is this is character, this is setting, like Pizza Hut, if you're in the Girl Scouts. So this is setting, then you have problem, which is a thumbs down. Then feeling in response to the problem is this little tear. And then you've got plan, or I mean, attempt or action, right? Now, in our older videos, we have it where the shooting, like it's a shooting star out. This is where my students hit each other. So like now I've got to deal with behavior problems. Um, I love the idea of grabbing a star and putting it in your pocket. So you're not only, and the OTs would love this, you're crossing your midline, right? And not only are you doing that, but you're keeping your hands inside your personal space, right? So you could also call it put a seatbelt on because that's a plan and that's an action, right? That's doing something right. So you can come up with some modifications, but you now you see why. All right, let's get rid of my background. Sorry. Okay, then I have step three, right, is about retelling the story as a group. And this is where I want learners to make connections between the WH questions that they're going to hear all over the place and they've been hearing their whole lives. What were you doing at your dad's house last weekend? Was she there? Like, these are questions that familiar to my household and my childhood. Um, but this is where you're not gonna have students raise their hand, and this is difficult for some people. This is where choral responding and signaling come in. Okay, so you're gonna repeat these steps right here for all of the questions, but this is a basic story structure. So I only have 5 story grammar icons out in these 5 illustrations. The icons are on the illustration, so everything's good to go. I basically just say, okay, everybody, let's get an answer in your brain right here. So let's get your thoughts hands down. Put a bubble in your mouth, okay? All right, just wait. Put that bubble in. Who was the story about? And I'm pointing to the icon, not the picture, because I want students to attend to the icons. Who was the story about? And then I call on someone because everybody should be. They're not going to be quiet. Let's be realistic. And there are going to be kids that still raise their hands. But until they get the hang of this, I call on someone. If this is intervention, I know they're going to fail, right? Because I called on them because they need more practice on this particular icon. So I'd say, like, who was the story about? Remember, John was riding his bike. Who was the story about? Elias. And then Elias, my student, would go ahead and hopefully have heard that I gave him the answer and say, John was riding his bike. Right? And then I say, okay, everybody, John was riding his bike down the street. Let's say that together. 1, 2, 3. And then you can do this like cue where everybody chorally responds at the same time. So just little tips, but that's the basic thing. It's just like everybody thinks of the answer. Everybody, everybody like doesn't blurt out or raise their hand. I call on someone, either give them the answer because I know they're not going to have it, or I go ahead and make sure that I give like a wait time. They're going to give the answer. I can recast what I want everybody to hear and repeat. And you do that for each of these WH questions, right? Now, then we have um, 4, partner retail. That's like the last step right here. And then after this large, like we're going to put the pieces of the story together. Um, then after this large team retell, we get to the step where we're going to basically fade out the visuals and we're going to use that evidence-based instructional practice of peer tutoring. Okay. In this last step, we want to remove, take down, turn off, whatever you have the illustrations and the icons presented and out, you want to make sure they're not anymore. Okay. And so take those down because those are visual supports. You want to pass out the champs checks, and it's 1 per pair. Sometimes if you don't have enough, you're going to group kids in threes. But 1 per pair of students, you want a dry erase marker. They go off together. One student is the listener or tutor, the other is the storyteller. And as the storyteller retells a story, their partner marks off whether they included it and they're giving each other feedback. Like that's the whole part, right? During this particular time, you're walking around with any other adults in the room and assisting learners as needed, praising their checking behaviors and their storytelling behaviors, right? And then usually to wrap up, everybody comes and then they trade off. So the students in that group, in that pair ideally, would have like there's 2 columns. The first student checks, and then he or she or they give their champs check to the other student, and then that student fills in that second column check. When it looks like everybody is pretty much done on average, then you're gonna call them back to the group area, collect the champs checks. I usually give them to a student who needs something to do and wipe them down while I'm talking and create a champ cheer. You know, like if everybody loves story champs, say, yay, story champs. You'll see that in videos. But I also take this time to pass out the take home activities because if you use a level A or level B story, and the lesson plan would tell you to do so, um, guess what? You have a take home activity for that story that can go home with the student that day. So I would have them all printed out. I would read the instructions at the top to my students. I might role play the first few times that I'm going to send these home. I might role play the role of a caregiver, right? And I might model how a caregiver would respond to the student after school if they saw it. And then I would instruct the students to take this piece of paper and take it home, put it in their take home folder in their backpack so that they can go be the teacher later that day. So that's large group. And then I want to make sure that we have enough time for a small group lesson. So similarly, the materials are up here, but I did want to show this too because this is how I use differentiation. So, and I use my data. So here, the procedures, we provide a lot of visual supports up front, are modeling the story. I mean, across large group, small group, and one-to-one lessons, it always starts off with you model the story, right? So that's the same. But this time, after I read the story the first time, I put out the story grammar icons. I actually ask the entire group to assist with the story retell. I'm not doing that WH question asking and core responding that I did at large group. Small group lessons is the team retell at step 2. So I basically have the illustrations out on the table, but I collect because after I read the story in part 1, I collect those icons, or if I'm using digital presentation link, I reset it. And I assign specific students to icons. But here's what happens to the students. So the illustrations are out, I gather the icons, and then I randomly, air quotes purpose, assign the students particular icons that they need to work on because this is intervention and these are the icons that they or the story grammar parts that they struggle with based on data. So I'm very purposeful about who gets which icon. So if you look at the image on the right, here's I have 3 students, RR, AS, and LS. So you'll see on the team retail section, RR has the letters C and F circled, and that's a prompt to myself as the interventionist to randomly, right, assign that student the character and feeling icons most of the time. Not always, but like most of the lesson days. And I want them to not work on anything else, right? And then I do this because RR is consistently, like for the NLM on the benchmark and progress monitoring forms, missing those in their story retells. Student AS misses the ending, and then LS has P for problem next to them. And so most of the time I'm giving them those. And there are other icons available, right? But I'm going to just like you don't see action here. But anybody could get that one, right? So basically that's how I differentiate on step 2. And then the remaining parts, I only have 3 students in my group for this lesson. So I have RR, LS, and AS. So I don't do the step 6 because I don't have enough students. I don't have 4. And here's my decision making on who does in the rotations, who is going to do step 3, step 4, and step 5. No matter what story it is, here's how I make my decisions. The student in this group who needs the most support and is working on just retell someone else's story, but needs the most support is going to be at step 3 because they get not only the illustrations and the icons, but also my errorless teaching, right? Then this student right here is also working on retell. This is LS. They keep missing problem, and like that's an issue. So, but they don't need the illustrations as much as RR. So I remove the illustrations. This is the fading out of those visual prompts. I remove the illustrations, but they have icons out and they get my errorless teaching supports, those errorless learning thing, like techniques. So they never get anything wrong, but they don't need the illustrations. And then that 5th step, this is student AS and student AS. I'm going to have them work on their personal story. Okay. And so in this particular case, they work on personal story because they can do retell pretty well, but they need to start working on story generation. Okay. And so that's how you can differentiate within a lesson based on what the students need to work on. At each step, 3, 4, and 5, because the child or the student or the learner is doing this telling or retelling, the very last little like checkbox for you, and this is basically a fidelity checklist, the last checkbox is for you to summarize that story quickly. At these parts right here, you would not use the storybook anymore. You just want to, the reason being is that you probably were using errorless like full verbal prompts and the kid said it back again. And then you kept going and then you were recasting. Meanwhile, the other students are playing the story games. You want to make sure that they heard the story, that everybody heard it, you cleaned it up, it's cohesive and coherent. So you quickly summarize it. And that's pretty much why. At these steps, you see only one student is assigned to that step, unlike the team retell. So what are the other students doing? Playing story games so that they're not engaged in like, I don't know, poking each other with pencils. So I think that if you see this, pick story games. I love the story die. Um, that's like your Dungeons and Dragons, like the many-sided die. So with these, you don't roll them. So there are a lot of folks out there who are very afraid of them, but you don't roll them. You turn them to face up, or the icon is facing up as to whatever icon that their peer just said, told the story part about. So we always start with character, right? So while student RR was providing the first part of the story and says, John was riding his bike. That'd be great if they said that. John was riding his bike. I usually have story die in my hand and I'm modeling to them like, oh, does everybody have a character? It's got a face up. And then I'm looking at the other kids and making sure that the die, they've turned it so the character, the purple person icon is facing upward. That's how you use them. There's the bingo and there's story sticks, and you can also do story gestures if everybody they lose their right to have manipulatives. So sometimes there's days like that. And so you can still play story gestures, and that's how you would do so. And then finally, this is what a one-to-one lesson plan looks like. This is awesome. This was a image that was shared with us, parent permission, and an extension of a lesson in which they used other manipulatives to help retell that story. So that's an extension. That's not a part of the lesson plan, but that just goes to show how kids love it. When you don't get things wrong, they love it. So this is where we basically move from basic story structure to retelling other people's stories into how to generate their own story. Okay, so sometimes we have it where we recommend you use sticky notes. You don't have to be a good illustrator, but you use sticky notes. And as the student is generating parts of their story, you go ahead and draw it out on a sticky note, like a piece of paper, and those become the illustrations, and you put the icons on those, and that's how it goes. Now, eventually, you would fade out those sticky notes, which are the illustrations, just like you would for the story illustrations for our stories, and then fade out the icons, and then nothing eventually. So that's how that general gist goes. And then you've got these add-on lesson plans. So here's what these look like. How do you use them? Um, you print out the add-on lesson plan, right? You keep your lesson plan that you've been using. And in the top corner, you'll see, consider add-on lesson plans 58 through 62, right? So let's say I picked one of those. So I picked 62. Basically, you're just adding a step and inserting it where it needs to go above the step that's already there. So find the matching number and insert it above. Basically, it's to help you add in a step. It kind of makes things more interesting for you too. So if you're bored of the same lesson plan after 6, 7, 8 sessions, it's 8 different stories, but you're kind of bored of the techniques or like the steps, mix it up. Do a writing add-on. I don't recommend doing causal and temporal connections yet, but like do a writing add-on, maybe do information structure one day and do those lesson plans. Vocabulary, explicit vocabulary instruction. Here's one where the Blitz vocabulary, how to teach vocab words using context. Here's the add-on lesson plan for that. So you do 1, 2, 3, and then you finish the steps of the regular lesson plan. So you do need both lesson plans still, but this is basically, we did add-ons um, so that we don't have to have like a million lesson plans. So just adding a step, you can do it to a large group, small group, or one-to-one. Otherwise, we would have had to like create this many more lesson plans. So that's why we have add-ons. Stephen just wrote a comment, and I love it that they have with this personal story generation and the sticky notes, they take the post-it notes back to their classroom and they use it for their writing practice with class. I love hearing that. That makes my day. So that in a nutshell is our lesson plans. Seriously, is an hour. I do trainings that are 6 hours long. So sorry, you're not supposed to feel like an expert. It is very quick, slow and steady. You fake it till you make it. Those are my recommendations. Here's some the references. If you need a webinar certificate form, I'm going to throw the link in the chat. But if you're watching this recorded later on, and you've got the QR code that will take you to that document and get your certificate. But yeah, if you're new to Story Champs, just pick, let's say you're at this point in the school year, please just pick pick one group. Don't get overzealous. So just say, I'm going to get really good at doing master lesson plan for the small group, this particular lesson plan. And that's how I would do it. And I would get through the rest of the school year, not the 6 sessions. You need to give yourself permission to not give up. Okay, so I think it's very feasible for you to learn one thing, then that's it. And if it takes, because there's so much, time is of the essence, right? If you have any more questions, I'm here for you. You can reach me at training@languagedynamicsgroup.com. And then here are upcoming webinars next month, how to teach complex academic language. I'm going to go into the lesson plans that deal with the modifiers, causal and temporal ties. Get an hour spent on that. April, information lessons. Woo! I'm going to go through those. Man, we've got champs checks for those too. So if you haven't used those yet, I highly encourage you to use them. Then I'm going to do for older students how to use Story Champs, or how to adapt Story Champs for your older students, your middle school and high school students. How to expand Story Champs lessons in June. So like when you saw those manipulatives come out in the dollhouse and the furniture. And then this summer, and on the other side of the world, getting into the winter, we'll have universal screening benchmark. We're having a new cubed version come out. Da, 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 and the diamond, the dynamic assessment of narratives. So we hope to be done with the diamond data collection by July. And so in the fall slash, oh my gosh, spring, we should be ready with that. And that will hopefully, so what I'm thinking is September. And then we'll get into the latter part of the year. Here are our topics. So you can sign up for any or all of these. You can forget about it and I'll still send you a recording as long as you're signed up. But other than that, that's it for me tonight or today or this morning. So I really, really appreciate your attendance. Um, yeah, it's been quite a week, and I appreciate really all of you that have been active participants in this and really caring about your learners and your clients. So thank you so much. And I will see you again, yes, hopefully next month. Thanks all.